Thakur's appearance day. And we have the only deity of Srivasa in the continental United States, which is special. It's a big deal. One devotee, Ravindra Prabhu, my Shiksha Guru, had a desire to put Panchatattva deities in Philadelphia with the idea that our deities are facing away from the ocean. So if you stand here and look at the deities, they're standing at the western shore of the world, because the next place you get to is the Far East. Like Japan or China is the next place you run into. I know there's a small island of Hawaii. It's kind of irrelevant for the point I'm trying to make. But he had the idea of getting deities of Panchatattva on the East Coast, facing away from the Atlantic, so that the Panchatattva was looking westward from the East Coast and eastward from the West Coast, and they were embracing the whole United States or all of North America with their vision. I always thought that was a really nice sentiment. They didn't manage to do it. They have Radha Krishna deities in Philadelphia. It's a lot of worship. Radha Sharad Bihari, I believe, is the deity's name. So we're special. We've got the only deity of Srivasa. You need that door open, don't you? Okay. Can we open that door for you? Let's open this door for you, and let's get him a chair over here. And we'll open this door for you. That'll be better. They're bringing you a chair. No, you should sit here. That way you're by the open door. You sure? All right, we'll close that door too. So it's special. Our temple's unique in all the temples in the world. At least in all the temples in the US, we have this deity of Srivasa. And I was thinking of, why do we have a deity of Srivasa? What is it about Srivasa? What's so special about Srivasa? Now, we've got these different tattvas. So you've got one Prabhu, or two Prabhus and one Mahaprabhu. So Nityananda and Advaita are Prabhus, and then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is Mahaprabhu, the great Prabhu. Vallabhacharya is also called Mahaprabhu. So other lineages also call their, founder Mahaprabhu. And then we've got that the three of them are Isha Tattva, the Lord, and then the other two, Srivasa and Gadadhar, are Shakti Tattva. They're the energy of the Lord. So the energetic Lord, and then the Lord's energy, or the Lord and his power, like a flame, and then the heat and the light from the flame. So then Gadadhar represents the internal energy, and then Srivasa represents the marginal energy. Interestingly, I was surprised to find out that the Swami Narayan people have a similar teaching. They have their gurus from the 1800s, and they identified them all with various tattvas and shaktis. And actually, this is true in a lot of lineages. They give some philosophical They try to find some philosophical symmetry, almost like geometry, some sort of elegant way in which their founders or the most important people in their lineage fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, and the pieces all fit together perfectly, and each personality represents a different tattva. So on one hand, we've got our schemas. So you can divide it up Panchatattva, 5 tattvas, but they break into 2 categories: Shaktiman, the possessor of power, and Shakti, the power. And so then that's Mahaprabhu, Nityananda, and Advaita, and then Gadadhar and Srivasa. Another way to break it up is into 3 tattvas. So that's 2. Then you can break it up into 3. And you've got the Lord, and then the Lord's internal energy, and the Lord's marginal energy. So that would be 3. Then within the Isha tattva, you can break that up. And Advaita is interfacing with the material world, and Nityananda is interfacing with the spiritual world, and one of them is a spiritual incarnation, and the other one's for Srishti Leela, for the creation of the world. Then you can look at them all collectively as Panchatattva, the 5 of them together as a unit. But then the reason why they have value as a unit is because each one of them is an essential piece of the puzzle. So there's different ways you can look at the deities, and other groups do the same thing. And it's what happens when you have a revelation and then you have a philosophical tradition. You start to ascribe meaning to all the different elements of the revelation, and it had to be that way. It had to be that way. Sometimes this is problematic, like within Christianity. Jesus died, and they had tried to come up with an argument that he had to die. But if you got God who created a world where Jesus had to die, that's not an all-good deity. Because an all-good God could create a world where Jesus didn't have to die. Maybe he did die, but at least he didn't have to. But if you have to say he had to die, it had to be like that, and he had to bleed to wash away the sins of man, it starts to challenge the idea that God's all good. Because certainly it's pretty easy to think of a world where God created a world and living entities had free will, and some of them did bad and some of them good, but they could be rectified without somebody needing to bleed and suffer on a cross and be tortured. Do you guys follow this? So we've got our Panchatattva, and we got to figure out why it had to be that way. And of course, the Panchatattva didn't descend as it's not like the Bible descended at the same time Jesus did. Different people wrote, and the Bible was the books that won. They won in a vote. Other books got outvoted. Other gospels weren't as attractive. Other ideas about the nature of Jesus weren't as attractive. And so certain ideas about Jesus, certain sacred texts, they got voted in, and other ones got voted out. So it's not like the Panchatattva descended and then that was it, and it was just the Panchatattva. There were a ton of Mahaprabhu's associates who were all super dear to him. Why Srivasa? Okay, Nityananda, you can argue, all right, it's Balaram, it's Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Okay, Gaur Nitai, all right, that works. Right? But Advaita, there were a bunch of elders. Srivasa was an elder, as was Advaita, but there were other elders. Nilambar Chakravarti, and there were other elders that were there around that time. Different associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Brahmananda Bharati. So why is it that Advaitacharya was chosen? Okay, well, he played a super important role. He called for the Lord to come down into this world. So even though he's only Vishnu, because when you're in Vrindavan, being Vishnu isn't a cool thing anymore. It's a problem. If you're dealing with a deity that's able to love intimately, and then you have a deity like Vishnu who can't love intimately, that deity becomes far less primal, and it becomes much more secondary because it lacks the intimate, sweet features of Krishna. Balaram's at least from Vrindavan. Vishnu's from Vaikuntha. It's a long ways from Vrindavan. The gopis aren't particularly interested in Vishnu. Sometimes Krishna transforms into Vishnu to hide from the gopis, and they say, Prabhu, Prabhu, please tell us where's Krishna. They have no affection for Vishnu except that he might know, because he's omniscient, where Krishna might be at that moment. We're even told not to hear about Vaikuntha. Raghunath Das Goswami says, don't even listen to stories about Vaikuntha. Some of our acharyas don't even want to leave Vrindavan. They're afraid of leaving Vrindavan. Mostly our devotees rush back to Vrindavan. They're not going to Tirupati. They go to Vrindavan. So, but Advaita's in there. We know how he's in there. He called for the Lord to appear. It's a leitmotif in our teachings. So he made it there. Gadadhar, it's Radharani. So Radharani and Balaram, pretty much your top tier in Vrindavan. Right? You could also say the Advaitacharya has, you have a romantic relationship, you have a fraternal relationship, and then the Advaitacharya has a parental relationship with the Lord. You could go that way, and you could say all the major rasas are represented in the Panchatattva. You know where that comes from? You know where we get that idea from? Neither. I just thought of it for the first time ever in my whole life just now. And of course, if that was the case, then Srivasa represents Dasya. Advaita represents Vatsalya. Nityananda represents Sakya Bhav, and then Radharani represents Shringar Rati. So that works. That works pretty good. But there's a lot of the Lord's devotees. I mean, once you get to the Srivasa level, Advaita, okay, he's special. Nobody else called for the Lord to come down. Nityananda, special. Balaram Hoilo Nitai. Vrindavaneshwari Sri Radha became Gadadhar. Okay, they all made the cut. But why Srivasa? What's special about Srivasa? Why does he represent all the jivas? The Lord had a lot of followers. We even say Srivasa Adi. That Adi and Srivasa Adi, that means Srivasa is just the head. He's called the Bhakta Gana Senapati. He's the chief of all the bhaktas. But why? So Srivasa Adi, Adi means etc. So Srivasa and others. So even Srivasa in our mantra, which you won't find in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. That mantra is not there in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. We don't exactly know where it came from. We have mantras like Panchatattva Makam Krishnam, and we have various chants that include the names of the different associates of the Lord in the Panchatattva, but this particular mantra that we chant, we don't exactly know where it came from. And even the idea of the Panchatattva, that came about, you find that in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which is 1611. You find it earlier, maybe in the 1570s, in the Gorganadesh Deepika of Kavi Karnapur. But considering that the Lord appeared in 1486 and left Navadvip by 1510 and left this world by 1534, you've got, a couple of generations passed before this Panchatattva thing was fully established. Now, if you look at like the Chaitanya Bhagavat, some of the early biographies, you find Gadadhar shows up, minor role. Even in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Gadadhar's in a minor role. You find Nityananda is in a big role in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, smaller role in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, to be quite honest. Not quite as big of a role. Not tiny, but not quite as big. Advaita's kind of there throughout, but there's a bunch of other people. How about Shuklambar Brahmachari? How about Nrsinga Brahmachari? There's all sorts of great personalities that are there in the Lord's pastimes. Early associates. You have these lists of the shakas, that came from the Lord, the major trees that came from the Lord, and there's tons of personalities. Srivasa doesn't have a shaka. Nityananda, Gadadhar, and Advaita do, but Srivasa doesn't even have his own shaka. He doesn't have his own branch of disciples. The same way the other Parivars and Vangsas do lineages. So why did he make the list? There's like Dhananjay Pandit and others, like big gurus, Udaradatta Thakur. They all had some claim. They all associate with the Lord in various ways. How about Shivananda Sain? There's all sorts of ones. I want to name like a bunch of associates, but there's a ton of potential competitors. So what makes Srivasa special? That was what I was thinking today. What makes Srivasa special? Are you stunned by this 4 Russes? Huh?
I'm stunned and intrigued. I want to go.
Did your heart skip a beat when I said that? My heart skipped a beat, and then I realized Srivasa for Dasya, and it skipped another beat. I did a double heart murmur. I don't know if a heart murmur is actually your heart's leaking. It's not missing beats. I don't know what you call it when your heart misses beats. So, what is it about Srivasa? That was what I was thinking about today. And so instead of just coming up with the philosophy and fitting everybody together, I started to really think, what is it about this person that's so special that he was chosen to represent all the jivas? That was the question I was asking myself. Okay, it's good that we have these schemas. We have the rasa schema, we have the tattva schema, different ways of looking at the Lord's pastimes and the Lord's associates to fit him into a mosaic, a tapestry where everything, an embroidery, where everything makes sense and is beautified, fits together beautifully. So okay, I'm good with that. But why was Srivasa chosen to represent the jiva as the leader, as the bhakta pradhan, as the leader of all the bhaktas? What was it about him? That was my question. Anybody got any thoughts? Leave that door open, would you? Just in case somebody comes. Anybody got any thoughts? Yeah.
There's 2 leads, but not
Okay, yeah.
either one lead is that he was chosen for the nocturnal kirtans.
He was chosen for the nocturnal kirtans.
His house. Is
Okay.
The other would be as the incarnate of Narada Muni.
Narada Muni is also not the greatest devotee. So that doesn't work either. How about Stoka Krishna? How about Sridama? You know what I mean? There's a whole bunch. Sudama. There's a whole bunch. So that one I say no to. The nocturnal kirtan one, which sounds weird when you say that. It sounds kind of vampirish. I don't know if I like that term. That also sounds weird. Sleepover kirtans, the overnight kirtans. I like all-night kirtans. That sounds better. I think that more conveys what's trying to be stated. They were all-night kirtans. They were kirtans which were so ecstatic that they went on all night. Akhand kirtan, ceaseless kirtan, all-night kirtan. What would happen is they would get together at Srivasa's house and they would do kirtan and they would stay up all night doing kirtan. And they would lock the doors of the house and they would do kirtan in the courtyard, and so that other people couldn't see what they were doing, and they would dance and chant in great ecstasy, and that kirtan eventually busted out and overflowed, and that became the genesis of the Harinam Sankirtan movement. Right here, Prabhu, we got your seat for you. I got you some cushions too. So I like that one. I think that's an excellent answer. So he had a primary role. Now, why was his house chosen for the nocturnal kirtans? That, you could do the Socratic thing where you just ask the question again. But I don't know, and this is an important point I want to make. I don't know, like for instance, Radharani wears a red sari. Generally, we say Radharani wears a blue sari, Neelambar. And that's true. She wears a blue sari that reminds her of Krishna. But she also has Raktambar, a red sari, and that's because her romantic love for Krishna is communicated by the color rag, which means reddish, also means attachment, also means color in general, and so that it represents that. Why does Krishna wear a yellow dhoti? Because it reminds him of Radharani? That works, right? Right? Okay, Krishna also wears a multicolored garment. He also has a 4-piece garment, different colors. He He also has a Harlequin type costume where he looks like a court jester with a bunch of different colors. How come those outfits? I think at some point you can also invoke the idea that Krishna likes certain things and therefore he chooses certain people and certain things. The idea that logic is higher than God's own free will and choice would indicate that logic is actually God, and it would take away to some extent the sweetness of a personal deity that's capable of making decisions. Why does Krishna have 4 primary flutes instead of 6? Why does he have 900,000 cows instead of 950,000? Why does he have 16,108 wives instead of 17,264? You follow? You can start to ask those questions, but at a certain point, I do think it's reasonable to invoke because Krishna likes that. I think if you go too far with that argument, that Krishna likes that, it becomes problematic because you don't ask any questions whatsoever. But I think if you go too far with logic, you end up making logic greater than God, and you lose something of the personal nature of the deity and the fact that God has free choice. How come there's 108 primary gopis? How come there's 8 primary gopis? You follow? How come one of them is named Tunga Vidya? Which means like secret knowledge. It's a tantric term, actually. But anyway, sometimes, Balaram, strength, pleasure. Why is his name strength, pleasure? Certainly there are other names that could be there for Balaram. Why is Krishna's father named Nanda? You follow? You get what I'm saying? And so, at a certain point, because his dad named him that, because his dad liked the name. Like, why did I name my children the name I liked them? Because I liked the names. It's not always that personal like and personal love don't play a role in things. So, why was Srivasa's house chosen? I don't know, he had the biggest house on the block. You know what I mean? You could argue that, right? It's not that you couldn't argue that. One thing, he was also an elder. Malini actually breastfed. His wife actually breastfed. He had 2 wives, but one of them was Malini. The primary one was Malini. She breastfed Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. She was his wet nurse. Did you know that? Right? It's pretty cool. So they had an intimate relationship with the Lord. They were elder. They were established, as was Advaitacharya. They were brahmanas in the community. They were doing Sankirtan before the Lord appeared. If you read Chaitanya Bhagavat, they were doing Sankirtan before the Lord appeared. They were praying for the Lord's appearance. Haridas used to walk around doing Sankirtan also before the Lord appeared. So these personalities they're elders, so they were already on the scene when the Lord appeared, so it makes sense that they would immediately get woven into his primary group, just like your parents and your family when you're born become your primary tribe, because they were there from the very beginning of your life. You have the longest relationship with them. I've known Jaidev for 35 years. Known Kishori for 24? Wow. Right? Known Rupanuga is at 20 now? So no longer I know people. 15? How long have I known you? 13. I'd say the longer you know somebody, the closer you are to them. So there's that. He had a big house. There's that also. But I think you could also just say Srivasa had a sweet enough personality. He understood the Lord's mission enough. He was enlightened enough about the Sankirtan mission. His heart was with the Sankirtan movement enough that the Lord chose his home. And then because that home became the springboard for the Sankirtan movement that ultimately is radiating even here, we just did Kirtan, then Srivasa is now on the board as one of the 5. I think that's a reasonable argument. Rupanugaji, you agree?
Yes.
All right, so I think that's a good one. I like that one. You got another one?
I'm thinking of his extraordinary qualities that you brought out, like Dasyaras. He was perhaps the most devoted, and his own son had passed on while the Kirtan was going on, and he did not want that to interrupt the Kirtan that Mahaprabhu was doing.
Yeah, I like this answer too. Srivasa's home was the birthplace of the Sankirtan movement. Why? Because Srivasa's personal qualities were special. He was special. Now, all pure devotees are special. So you got to be careful. Like why was Prabhupada? Why is Prabhupada so, why do we love Prabhupada so much? Because he loved Krishna. Well, all great Vaishnavas love Krishna. Well, what makes Prabhupada special? He loved Krishna the most? I don't know that I want to say that because we got a bunch of cowherd boys incarnating and a bunch of cowherd girls. I don't really want to say, he loved Krishna more than Rupa Manjari, for instance. I don't know if I want to go that route. You follow? And so you start to go down this road of they were the best. It starts to become the best and therefore better than others. Now, it's an Indian thing. You get to say they're the best, and it doesn't mean others aren't also the best. It's very common to say, this is my best friend, and this is also my best friend, and this is my most best friend, and he's my most best friend as well. It's like very, very common, right? In the West, it's like, wait, hey, my friends sometimes get on my case, like, how many best friends do you have? And they get bent out of shape. I want to say everybody's my best friend. They get bent out of shape by it. But if you're from India, it's not bewildering. It's not strange. And so it's very common to say this is the greatest Vaishnava, this is the greatest devotee, etc. But if you want to really appreciate somebody, you got to figure out what's unique about them, because we're all unique. So Srivasa gets picked a lot. He gets picked a lot. Let me give you I'll give you 3 things that Srivasa was picked for, where he got to stand at the head of the class and represent all the devotees. One day, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shuklambar Brahmachari, came to see the Lord, and he had a bag of rice with him that he had begged. And the Lord was so ecstatic seeing his devotee that he began eating the rice, the raw rice. And so Shuklambar is such a great devotee, like Vidur, who the Lord ate banana peels from his house. The Lord ate raw rice, all like Sudama, same thing, chipped rice. So the Lord, in ecstasy, explained to Shuklambar Brahmachari about, there's a famous verse, Hare Nam, Hare Nam, Hare Nam, Eva Kevalam, Kalo Nastyeva, Nastyeva, Nastyeva Gatiranyata. So, Na Asti Eva. Certainly there is not. Anyata, another. Gata, another means to the goal. Hare Nam, Hare Nam, Hare Nam, Eva Kevalam. Certainly it's the only thing, the holy name. And the Lord explained, the holy name is mentioned 3 times. It's a verse from the Naradiya Purana that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu quoted. Hare Nam, the holy name is mentioned 3 times. Eva is mentioned 3 times. Kevala means only, which emphasizes it. And then there is no other way is also mentioned 3 times. And so from every angle of vision, the verse is logically screaming at you at the top of its lungs, grammatically, that the holy name is the only way that you can achieve perfection. Do you guys follow that? So the Lord explained that verse, like I just said, and then gave further instructions. This means you can't do any karma or gyan. You can't try to enjoy. You can't ask for anything. You just have to do service. Then bhakti dharma posha. Then your bhakti dharma is nourished. Posha means nourished. And he gives an example. You can't beg for anything. You can't ask for anything. You have to tolerate anything. And then he began speaking about grass, being lower than the grass in the street. Then he began speaking about being more tolerant than a tree. Then he put together into the famous verse we have of lower than the blade of grass. But you see him working the verse out in Bengali before he comes up with the Sanskrit verse. Trees don't protest even if you cut them down. They ask for nothing even if they're drying up. The grass is just a straw in the street. You know, the street's muddy. Throw straw in the street to keep the street from getting muddy so people can walk on it. It's the lowest thing around. Take a straw between your teeth. Off the ground. She's showing how fallen you are. Almost like you're like making yourself a low caste. By picking up straw off the street and putting it in your mouth, you're like making yourself a low caste to show your humility in front of somebody. So he explained this. He said if you should never beg. If somebody gives you something, then you should eat. Otherwise, you can just eat some shaka pala. You can eat some spinach and fruits. Stuff you can just pick naturally. But you shouldn't beg from anybody even. Then he says, then your bhakti is maintained nicely. It's a really heavy standard. It's a really heavy standard. At some point in my life, I used to serve my guru, and I would wait until he told me to go eat before eating. And sometimes he wouldn't tell me to go eat, so I wouldn't go eat. And he'd usually figure it out by the end of the day when I was fainting or something like that, and tell me to go eat. But it's a really high standard. What to speak of trying to do that for your whole life. Buddhists, they set it up. The Buddhists go out and beg for 1 hour a day, but all the Grihasthas know to be home during that hour, and they get all the favorite food of the Buddhists. So when they come by to beg, they're all set up and taken care of, and society's set up in such a way where they get to go and beg from door to door, and it's all nice. The idea of not begging and just waiting to see if somebody gives you something without being asked, that's like a whole other standard. That's the Bilva Mangal Thakura standard, where Krishna himself comes and brings you food. So then he gave the example of Srivasa. The story that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu used to illustrate this principle I just espoused was the story of Srivasa. Srivasa was living in Navadvip. He was a respectable Brahmana living in Navadvip. Poor, but respectable. And everybody did kirtan at this house, and he was understood to be a great Vaishnava. And so there were people who were envious. The Pashandis were envious. I think Pashandi must be where you get the word Pashu from. Bound, Pasha. And so the Pashandis, it usually is translated as like a heretic or somebody outside the Vedic, non-believer, somebody outside the scope of the Vedic tradition. I believe the term goes all the way back to Manu, if I'm not mistaken. But I think probably the root of it is Pash, to bind. And so these people are bound up in Maya and they're beguiled. So anyway, the leader of the Pashandis, Pashandi Pradhan, he was the chief of the Pashandis, Gopal Chappal, he was a Brahmana. He couldn't stand the fact that Srivasa was being glorified and that they had their own little clique going on and they were excluding other people. Prabhupada said sometimes if there's any difficulty outside, you can close the doors of the temple and only allow bona fide chanters to come in for the kirtan. Only allow bona fide chanters. He says, but in general, we'll open our door and we've had good results. He mentions this in relation to this Leela, in his purports. And so, at that time, there had to be some exclusivity. Sometimes absence creates a little bit of respect. And if you're too available, people start taking you for granted. And so they kept things closed door. But then the people who weren't invited in got envious. They weren't invited in because they weren't qualified. That's why they weren't invited in, but they became disturbed. And so Gopal Chapel, secretly, in the night, he went to Srivasa's house. And outside his house, he put a plantain leaf with a hibiscus flower and some red sindoor and a pot of wine and a few other things outside, which are all, usually when you're worshiping Durga, then you use red things. Like, we're not supposed to offer hibiscus flowers to the deities. I serve hibiscus tea sometimes in my restaurant, but I'm always like I don't ever serve hibiscus tea at the temple. So certain things we don't offer. They're generally considered to be for Durga and not for Krishna. Red stuff, blood red stuff. Red chandan, which is just chandan mixed with vermilion. Sindoor. It's a red chandan. You take the chandan, you mix sindoor into it, becomes super red. And hibiscus flowers. And then wine is also offered. And so he put all the stuff outside the door, and he thought everybody will see that stuff outside his door in the morning, and they'll think secretly at night he's worshiping Durga. And I'll give him a bad name, and everyone will cancel him. That was his idea. Sometimes I hear, sometimes in India you'll hear gossip. Like, you'll be hanging out with some Indian devotees, and I'm like, oh yes, so-and-so, he's worshiping Kali, he's taking fish. And it's just not humanly possible that's true. But sometimes the level of gossip that Indian people get to, it just kind of boggles my mind that they go so low. I don't know if you've ever, you know what I'm talking about? Like a level of gossip that only, the only experience in India? Do you know what I'm talking about or not? It's crazy, right? Yeah. Like so-and-so's doing black magic. You're like, whoa, dude. You're like, come on. No, you don't mean, no, actually he's doing, I have seen. Like, you have not seen. Come on. And so I think, where are these people getting this from? But it's in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Like, it's like really high level skullduggery. And so it's just, it's you can Google it. Skullduggery. It's a word. And so, yeah, he did this. It was a real high level takedown campaign. So Srivasa came out of his house. He saw the paraphernalia. And then he just called all the Bhadralok, all the respectable people in the town. And he said, look, just see, I'm secretly worshiping Bhavani at night. I'm just a Vaishnava in name only. I'm not a real Vaishnava. I'm doing this nonsense. And then all the Badai Lok, all the respectable people in the village, they just said, what is this nonsense? Clean this up. And they got a sweeper. They wouldn't even touch it. They got the sweeper from the village to come and sweep it up. They purified it with cow dung and water and washed the whole area because they felt so disturbed that the front of his home had been contaminated. And they apologized. We're so sorry that these envious people are pestering you. And then 3 days later, Gopal Chapel, he got leprosy. And he had to leave the village because he became contagious. And he was living out there with his nose melting away and just really suffering like anything. By the bank of the Ganga. And the Lord went to go take his bath in the Ganga. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the incarnation of mercy, Mahavadanya Avatar, was taking a bath at the Ganga. And Gopal Chapel said, I am your uncle. Also, it's another thing that they do in the village. Everybody's your uncle or your cousin or your brother. And so you have to ask. You mean, like you say, like blood brother or village? And they'll say, no, village brother. Like, it just meant you're neighbors. You grew up in the same neighborhood. Even practically speaking, if you grew up in the same district. If you come to the West, then that person's your cousin. Maybe you never even met him back home, but once you get far enough away from home, even he was in the same district as you, then he becomes like your cousin or your uncle. So yeah, I'm your uncle. On your mother's side, we have some connection in our village relationship. And he said, please help me. Please save me. I'm suffering so much. And the Lord said, you haven't even begun to suffer. You offended my devotee, your suffering is going to go on forever, for many lifetimes. This is just the beginning. And he abandoned him and left. Years later, the Lord happened to go, stop by and met him again. And he again approached him. He said, okay, then go beg for forgiveness from Srivasa. Then you'll be forgiven. And he went and begged forgiveness from Srivasa, who took no offense, forgave him immediately, and then he was cured. Sometimes they say he became Devaki Nandan. Devaki Nandan Das, the famous Vaishnava poet, who wrote hundreds of verses glorifying Vaishnavas. There's a poet named Devaki Nandan. He wrote a song called Vaishnava Vandan, prayers to the Vaishnavas. And it's just the names of all the Lord's associates from Navadvip, all the Lord's associates from Puri, and all the Lord's associates from all over the world, from every other place. And it's just the names of Vaishnavas. I have respect to this Vaishnava, and this Vaishnava, and this Vaishnava, and this. And it's a list of hundreds and hundreds of Vaishnavas. And it's called Vaishnava Vandana. And it's just a way of praying to and glorifying and offering your obeisances to hundreds and hundreds of the Lord's associates going several generations down that Devaki Nandan would just recite daily. And sometimes they say that Devaki Nandan, he is Gopal Chapel. He became a Vaishnava. He became cured of his offenses. And he spent the rest of his life glorifying Vaishnavas. With the tongue that vilified them, he glorified them. So Srivasa that one's relatively easy to appreciate. It gets harder to appreciate Srivasa. That one's relatively easy to appreciate. Great Vaishnava, took no offense, rolled with the punches in life, and the Lord protect him. Allah Prahlad Maharaj, and so many great Vaishnavas, and his humility, and therefore that's the practical manifestation of this idea of not asking for anything from anybody if you don't get attached to personal glorification. That's the essence of what the Lord was trying to communicate. Amanina. You don't want any respect. So Srivasa's qualities were so exemplary in this regard, and in the Lord's Leela, he consistently manifested these qualities to such a superlative degree that he became synonymous with humility, and therefore became the acme or the epitome of what it means to be a Vaishnava. And he was the eldest, within that Navad we've seen, and he had these personal qualities, and as a result, his home was chosen as the place for the Lord of Performance Kirtan. And then all the other Vaishnavas who have those qualities, we can say to some extent they borrow them from Srivasa. He is the primary manifestation of that Vaishnava humility in the Lord's pastimes. And then all subsequent devotees who manifest those qualities, they are his Angas and Upangas, and therefore Srivasadi. I think that one works. We've got two more Leelas. And the exercise I was trying to do was I want to appreciate, beautiful ideas about symmetry and geometrical ideas and ideas where everything fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. But I don't want to merely appreciate that, because that lacks the individual element that Srivasa was this beautiful, great personality that had these wonderful, fine qualities such that he fit into that geometry. In other words, his personal qualities are why he fits into that geometry, not he fits into that geometry and therefore he manifested those personal qualities. Did you follow that? Why does Krishna play a flute? Why not another instrument? Why not a veena? Because it's simple, and he's simple. But there's other simple instruments, sure, but the flute's particularly beautiful. It's particularly seductive. Well, other instruments could be seen as being equally beautiful and simple, like an ektar or something like that, really easy to manifest and also quite beautiful. Yes, but Krishna likes the flute. You follow? At some point, the Lord is allowed to like chikus. He's allowed to like chikus. He's allowed to like playing the flute. That is also there. And so, at some point in a personalist philosophy, you've done enough philosophizing and you can start to, without being critiqued for being arbitrary, actually just talk about what the Lord likes. And when you do that, you don't lose the ability to then philosophize and theologize and think about what the ramifications of that are and point out some logic and reason behind it. But you don't only have logic and reason. You have a person and their personal feelings and their personal qualities, and you have the logic and reason. It's actually a much more powerful combination, and in some ways this one is more important, it's more intimate, it's higher. Once you've moved through this one, you can get into that one. And once you get into this one, you can go back and look at that one and you find even more beautiful stuff. So Srivasa had these amazing qualities. Therefore his home was chosen for the nocturnal kirtan, and therefore he made it on the list. So your explanation is based in his explanation, not vice versa. And I don't think we always make that simple connection. I don't even know if I've said it clearly enough for all of you now. But when you start to think about the logic and the reason, his home was for the nocturnal. Why was his home for the nocturnal? Because he was such a great Vaishnava. But what about all the other guys? Yes, but he was special. How was he special? His humility, his tolerance. How do we know that? Look at how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu used him as his own example of what these things are. He was the eldest, he was there first, and therefore he's the parent of all the other devotees who follow in his wake. Here's another one of Srivasa's stories. This one's more difficult to appreciate. This is a whole song. There's a song in Gita Mala. Bhaktivinoda Thakur has 4 songbooks. One of them is called Gita Mala. There's Gitavali. Gitavali is like a collection of songs. Then there's Gita Mala. Gita Mala is a string of songs. So the songs have different themes. So there's 13 songs called Shoka Shatama, the dispelling of grief. And it's about Srivasa Thakur. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur sings a song about Srivasa Thakur in a Leela. The Leela is first spoken of in Chaitanya Bhagavat, somewhat elaborately. The whole chapter, chapter 25, Adi Leela, maybe Madhya Leela, is dedicated to it. I don't know, 70, 80 verses. But then Bhaktivinoda Thakur, there's just a couple of verses in the Chaitanya Charitamrita about it. But then Shoka Shatana, there's 13 songs, 91 verses, dedicated to telling the story of Srivasa Thakur, divided into 13 songs, which each have a title that is the theme of the particular motif of what's happening at that moment in the Leela. And he really breaks down the song, and instead of just describing the Leela, he describes the sentiments of all the people in the Leela. And by understanding their sentiments, you more appreciate the Leela in a way that you don't from any of the other descriptions which are given, because he starts talking about the people who are involved in their feelings, which of course is exactly in line with the theme of my class. One day they were doing kirtan, and all of a sudden, in the inner house, the inner area of the house, there was this great sound of wailing and crying. And Srivasa immediately understood what was going on. He ran in the house, ran in the center of the house. And one of his sons had died. He had 5 sons, one of them had died. And the women were crying. And Srivasa, he consoled them. He said, this is a material world, we get attached, our attachment creates suffering, we have to become attached to Krishna. Krishna's there in the form of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu right now doing kirtan. We have to hear the kirtan, it's very auspicious. Our son died while hearing the kirtan. You can't control time and tide waits for nobody. We've all got our karma. We have to get used to letting go of things. He preached very beautifully. Then he told them, hey, just shut up. Pagalini. Shuno Pagalini. He told them, listen, you crazy women. The Lord's doing his kirtan in there. And if you cry too loudly, it will disturb him. So he preached to them for a little while. And then he said, the Lord's doing kirtan. I don't want to disturb the Lord's kirtan. So you all be quiet. How can we disturb the Lord's kirtan? The Lord's descended down from the spiritual world. He's doing kirtan in our home. Nothing should disturb the kirtan. See how that's a tough one to appreciate? And they shut up. They were quiet. And the kirtan went on for 9 more hours. And then in the morning time, the Lord said, I don't feel happy. Something happened here. I don't feel happy. You understand? 9 hours the kirtan went on with Srivasa just not breaking form whatsoever. Supporting the Lord in his kirtan. Shushing the women folk who were crying. Calming them down. Preaching to them. And also just telling them to be quiet. So the kirtan wouldn't be disturbed. And then the Lord said, I don't feel happy. What's going on? And then they said, oh, Srivasa's son died. The Lord started crying. The Supreme Lord started crying. Because he loves his devotees so much. He's Bhakta Vatsal. He felt so empathetic for Srivasa. And he also cried because he realized what a great Vaishnava Srivasa was, that he didn't even want to disturb the Lord's kirtan. And that made him cry. And Bhaktivedanta, of course, says, seeing the Lord crying for his devotee, I'm also crying. And then the Lord rushed into the inner chamber where the dead body was. And said, you know, what has happened? And began to preach to everybody. He told the ladies that you lost your son, but Nityananda and I will be your sons from now on. And so now you have 2 sons instead of 1. We will become your sons. And Bhaktivedanta, of course, crying, hearing that also. Stunned, hearing that also. And then the Lord said, let's go perform his funeral rites. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself performed the funeral of the child. And they went to the bed. And then as they took the baby out, the child out in the courtyard, and then the Lord said, speak. And the child sat up, was resurrected. So the nod to Christianity. The child sat up and said, I've spent my whole life turning away from Krishna, embracing the material energy, misusing my free will, and now is my fate. I've lived so many lives. I've been a father and a son and a mother and a daughter and everything, and I've been up and down and suffered in hellish conditions and been exalted in demigod-like conditions and taken unlimited births because I'm turning away from the Lord. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, I'm hearing this, I'm also realizing I've turned away from Krishna. And he said, but this time I'm dying and I'm in ecstasy because I heard the holy name. And I'm near to the Lord. And now I'm blessed. And that pacified everybody, realizing that the life was not lived in vain, but something wonderful had happened in this lifetime. And then the Lord put Srivasa's child's body into the other 4 children came out and pacified the parents. And then the Lord himself put the body in the Ganga, just like the Lord buried Haridas Thakur. So the Lord put the baby in the Ganga. And Jahnavi Devi, Ganga Devi personified, turned into a goddess and came out of the Ganga and embraced the child and offered prayers to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You could imagine the scene. Ganga Devi taking a form and coming out of the water to embrace the child and welcome the child and offer prayers to the Lord. And then everybody took their bath in the Ganga and life returned to normal. That one's like a middle difficulty level. Goes beyond what anybody can possibly conceive of doing in their lifetime. You know, somebody like criticizes you a little bit, all right, maybe take that on the chin, no big deal. What's the big deal, right? Especially if the criticism's foolish and not true, it's pretty easy to let it go. I mean, it's not easy for everybody, but you get a little older, you chant the holy name a little bit, you make a little advancement in spiritual life, and you can tolerate criticism. It doesn't totally knock you out. This one, it's light years more difficult to wrap your head around. It almost seems like he's callous. But you can kind of wrap your head around the extreme savant level of Vaishnavism that's being talked about. You can kind of wrap your head around. You follow? Next one you can't wrap your head around. It's impossible. Just sounds weird. One day the Lord saw Srivasa and said, Srivasa, you're not working. Go get a job. You just chant Hare Krishna all day long. You should go do some work. Srivasa says, I do kirtan. I don't do work. I just do kirtan. And he said, and if one day I don't eat, then my family will fast. The second day I do kirtan and nothing comes, the next day I'll fast. If the third day I do kirtan and nothing comes, then I'll just take my whole family, we'll drown ourselves in the Ganga. So Srivasa just did kirtan. He did not go out and work and have a job. He was a brahmana. He worshipped the Lord, did kirtan. And then he survived by donations that came. And when the Lord told him to go get a job and do his dharma and do his karma, like Krishna told Arjuna, Srivasa's response was, no, I'll just keep doing kirtan, keep doing my bhajan. And if one day nothing comes, then we all fast. 2 days, nothing comes, we all fast. 3 days, he clapped his hands 3 times. He said, then we all jump in the Ganga, me and my whole family. And the Lord laughed and said, Lakshmi Devi herself might go begging in the streets someday, but there will never be a lacking in your home. Now, threatening, ritual suicide or whatever, like infanticide and like suicide pacts and forced suicides and forced drownings, this kind of stuff is a bit so hyperbolic, which I think we should see it as hyperbolic. I don't think Srivasa was actually planning on doing that. But it did make the point that Srivasa had that much confidence in the Lord's protection, that he'd lean off a cliff and hold the Lord's hand. Say, hold my hand, and lean off a cliff. Say, what are you going to do? Don't you want something like that in your life? You lean off a cliff and hold their hand? Not even hold, just put your arm out, they hold your hand. No problem, you don't even need to hold. Lean back off a cliff. They love you so much, they'd rather die than let you go. So Srivasa feels comfortable with the Lord, leaning back like that, saying, what are you going to do? And the Lord laughed and said, yeah, Lakshmi Devi might have to go and beg, but you'll always have enough in your home. They're more and more difficult to appreciate, but what are we looking at? We're looking at this thick relationship of master and servant, where the Lord is my maintainer, He's my protector, He provides me whatever I need. Really the essence of Sharanagati. Sharanagati, actually, we didn't make that up. The 6 Sharanagati, the 6 symptoms of surrender: accept what's favorable, reject what's unfavorable, Krishna is your maintainer, Krishna is your protector, be super humble and surrender yourself to Krishna. Those 6 things, we didn't make those up. Those were made up 1,000 years prior by the Sri Vaishnavas. We borrowed that from them. Stotra Ratna. Text has been around for 700 years or something before we borrowed it. Bhaktivinoda Thakur writes a whole song about it, writes a whole songbook about it, or a whole series of songs about it. He exemplifies that. If you look at his life and times, it's just him manifesting these qualities of fearlessness, of humility, of tolerance, of simplicity, of trusting in the Lord, of being surrendered to the Lord. Therefore, he's a member of the Panchatattva. Therefore, he was chosen to represent all of us. Therefore, he's our forefather. Therefore, he's the person we glorify. We good? Do we make it? 60 minutes? Go ahead and turn it off so we don't lose it. Thank you, IGTV.